in Colossians chapter 3 today. In Colossians chapter 3, as we've been going section by section through Colossians chapter 3, as we've been looking at different pictures, beautiful pictures in this passage. There's many different ways that we could illustrate the pictures, but when we looked at the first verses, one of the first pictures in Colossians chapter 3 is for you and I to look up, is to set our minds on Jesus. If we will change where we're looking, it makes a difference. It helps us to focus our attention. It helps us to focus our direction. And the first encouragement that we had in Colossians chapter 3, the first several verses, was to look up. But then there were also a couple of sermons that we looked at about, one was putting to death. Putting to death sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness. And then we also looked at the mental picture of putting something off. Putting some things to death and putting some things off. And then today, of course, we're going to look at putting on. That as we look at Jesus, as we focus our eyes on Him, as we put to death things that shouldn't be in our lives, as we put off things that we don't need to have in our lives, today as we go forward, we're going to look at things that we should put on. And I can still vividly recall one day that the stench was overwhelming. And perhaps you've been in a similar situation like this. As I got onto the tram, I didn't know why, but the crowded tram, there was this whole area that was just wide open, full of seats. And I sat down in one of the empty seats. And as I sat down, suddenly the stench was overwhelming. And there was a man, and I don't know what had happened in his life. And perhaps you've been on public transportation and you've had an experience like this. As much as you didn't judge the man, who knows what had happened to him. But his clothing was so dirty and his odor was so strong. Literally, it took your breath away. And the stench was just overwhelming. And as we're looking at these pictures, and as they are symbolic, the Church of Jesus Christ has a huge problem in the world today because of sexual immorality. And the stench is overwhelming. And the Church of Jesus Christ has a problem today because our hearts want what we want. And there's a spirit of covetousness, which is idolatry. And the stench is overwhelming. And as Paul wrote to the Colossians, and as we've been looking at section by section, when we saw some things that we just need to put them off, the wrath, the anger that we are carrying within the Church of Jesus Christ, it just makes such a stench that it's overwhelming. And so as we look at Christ, as we put to death some things, as we put off other things, today we want to look at what we put on. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Paul says, "Put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive." We have these reminders of who you and I are. You are God's chosen ones. Right off the bat in these verses, Paul reminds his children who they are, They are the chosen ones of Christ. That is who you are today. When Christ looks at you, you are His chosen one, and you are holy. You are set aside for His purposes, and you are beloved. Is there somebody in your life that when they say to you they love you, you just feel it deep within your core? There's a statistic that the average person longs for 13 hugs every day. They long for those hugs. There was a man one time, he came to church specifically because of the fellowship time. Because it was the only time in the entire week that he had human contact with someone else. And it says medically, in order for a hug to do you good, it's got to last 20 seconds. I am married to one of the world-class huggers. She is gifted beyond belief. And there are many of you that are chuckling because you've received one of those hugs from her. And when she hangs on to you, you know that there's somebody who cares for you, who wants what's best for you, who wants you to succeed, who wants you to go forward. And Paul reminds us that because of Christ and what He's done, you are God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Next, there's this wonderful checklist. Put on, since this is who you are, compassionate hearts. Do you have a compassionate heart today? It's a reality of living in an urban setting. In order to survive, we guard our hearts and we become closed off to other people. It's just a reality. It's symbolized by when we step into elevators. When we step into elevators, you don't look at anybody. You look everywhere else. Because it would be too aggressive. It would be too... And if you've had the psychology class in university, you're those smart alecks that you step into the elevator and on purpose you turn and face the wrong way. You know that door's not opening. But you want to see how many other people will also turn and face the wrong way with you. And it works. But in the urban setting, we begin to guard our hearts and we become less compassionate. Kindness. Speaking words that are kind. Speaking words that are uplifting. Humility. Having a humility that puts other people ahead of ourselves. Having a humility that recognizes what someone else is able to do. Meekness. Some of your translations, for my ears, I understand meekness, but in some translations, you will find the word gentleness. And for my heart, that's what I'm more familiar with. I know that linguistically they're considered equivalents. And I don't know what kind of English speaks best to your heart. But that word, gentleness. And you and I see that time and time again when a new child is brought into a family. And the older siblings crowd around that child. And what do mom and dad say again and again? Gentle, gentle, gentle. Be careful. Gentle. Love the baby, but be gentle. Patience. And bearing with one another. Paul says, put these things on. In your own notes right now, which one of those is very easy for you? By nature, are you the one among us you don't have to work about a compassionate heart. That's just who you are. or kindness? Does that just come naturally to you? Or humility, meekness, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, putting up with somebody else. Some people have this tremendous gift of putting up with other people. Oh, you just got to ignore that. That's just the way they are. Which one of these comes easy for you? You're not bragging. You're not being arrogant. But when you look at this, as you're putting on that suit, you say, well, you know, actually, that one goes on really well. Lots of people, when the new year starts, they make a physical resolution to lose weight so that their clothes will fit better. Which one of these would you say, I could trim that up a little bit. I could, as I put that one on, maybe I've got this and this and this, but that's one that I could still work on. Bearing with one another. And then continuing in verse 13. The Bible says, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, so you also must forgive. There's this, it's not in the Bible. I mean, it is, but the illustration is not there. It's drawn on the graphic. There's this beautiful triangle of forgiveness. It's a beautiful thing that as we look at Jesus and we think about what He forgave us, and so then as we're looking at Jesus and as we're looking at somebody else and they've done something and it's offended us, what am I supposed to do? Look at Jesus. I look at Jesus. What did Jesus do? He forgave me. I look at them. What am I supposed to do? I don't want to do it. Look at Jesus. What am I supposed to do? Look at Jesus. What am I supposed to do? Look at Jesus. Okay, He forgave me. I'm supposed to forgive them. And then as soon as I forgive them, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to forgive me. And there's this beautiful triangle. And as it goes round and round, it brings these multiple pieces together. That as we focus our eyes on Jesus, as we put some things to death, as we throw some things off, as we put on the new self, when we get into the situations of life that cause us irritation, then we just need to keep that triangle going round and round and round. Anybody here have a washing machine at home? Isn't a washing machine one of the most wonderful inventions of modern times? You take your old dirty clothes and you stick them in that washing machine and you throw in some soap and you add some water and in the washing machine that Minnie and I have, it goes like this. It just turns and tumbles and tumbles and tumbles and tumbles and tumbles. And those clothes, they just get all mixed up in there, just tumbled and tumbled and tumbled. And they just round and round and round and round and round. Now, of course I'm being silly. If this was children, we could have more fun with this. If our clothes could only talk, if the sleeve of our shirt could only say to the trouser leg, "Stop twisting me up. I don't like it. That doesn't feel good." If the sweater could say to the blue jeans, "Quit pulling me apart. I don't like that." But you put those dirty clothes in that washing machine, they just go round and round and round and round and round. And it does its work. And then what happens when you take those clothes out and you untwist them? You're just so nice. And you and I, folks, are in this together. And it's in the human interaction that we have with one another that God works His mysterious work of grace. And we just go round and round and round and round. And we get all twisted up and we get all tangled up. And sometimes it takes us a lot to get undone. But there's a beautiful thing that happens in that triangle of forgiveness. There's another picture. It's kind of amazing. You've been walking along a beach somewhere and you've seen this. You've seen these stones that are on the seashore. And they're kind of different colors, but they're just kind of, they're not very bright. But occasionally you see one of those stones. And if you take that stone and you put it in a tumbler and you add the friction of sand or something else like that, there's friction in that process. But as that stone just gets tumbled and tumbled and tumbled and tumbled around, what happens to that stone? It becomes polished and polished and polished and polished. And then we can have our next picture. Those stones, they didn't look bad to begin with. But in that friction of being refined, they became even more and more beautiful. So today, as you and I enter into relationship with Jesus, we focus our eyes on Him. We put to death things that shouldn't be in our life. We put things away that only hinder us. And then we begin to put on these things that He speaks about. Compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another as we continue to remember what Christ did for us. And as Christ does His work in our hearts, something beautiful emerges. What will you choose to put on today? As you look at these passages that God speaks to your heart, what would it help you to put on today? To practice today? Let's pray.